I'm Aria.
And I'm Joella.
And we read A Case of Identity. So we're going to summarize this story and include all of the inductive and deductive evidence.
Inductive reasoning is where you draw a conclusion through observation.
And deductive reasoning is when you draw a conclusion through factual evidence.
When Sherlock Holmes sees a woman oscillating across his office on the pavement, he concludes that oscillation upon the pavement always means that she would like advice but is not sure whether the matter is too delicate for communication.
Sherlock Holmes says that when a woman has been seriously wronged by a man, she no longer oscillates. He therefore concludes that it's a love matter, but that the maiden is not so much angry as grieved.
These are both examples of inductive reasoning.
The woman named Miss Mary Sutherland walks through the door. After only seeing her appearance, Mr. Holmes asks her, "Do you not find that with your short sight it's a little trying to do so much typewriting?" Miss Mary Sutherland is surprised that he knows she has bad eyesight. She is also surprised to find out that he knows she's been typewriting.
Later in the investigation, Mr. Holmes tells Mr. Watson that this woman had plush upon her sleeves, which is a most useful material for showing traces.
A double line a little above her wrist, where typewriters pressed their hand against the table, was beautifully defined.
A sewing machine leaves a similar mark on the left arm, except she had a mark on her right hand. He further observes 2 indents on either side of her nose. He then tries to venture a remark about short-sighted and typewriting.
This is yet another example of inductive reasoning. Since Sherlock Holmes sees that this woman is otherwise neatly dressed, he concludes that the reasoning for her half-buttoned shoes that are not matching is because of her hastiness.
This is inductive reasoning.
When Miss Mary Sutherland begins to tell Mr. Holmes about her case, she mentions her father, Mr. Windibank. He then asks her if she's referring to her stepfather, because they have different last names. Surely enough, she informs him that he's right.
Mr. Holmes concludes it through deductive reasoning because she has a different last name than he does.
Miss Mary Sutherland tells Mr. Holmes that Mr. Hosmer Angel was a very shy man. He would rather walk with her in the evening than in the daylight because he hated to be seen. His voice was gentle. He had the quinsy and swollen glands when he was young, he told her, and it had left him with a weak throat and a hesitating, whispering fashion of speech. He was always well dressed, very neat and plain, but his eyes were weak just as hers are, and he wore tinted glasses against the glare. Mr. Holmes took this into consideration later in his investigation. She also told Mr. Holmes that during her relationship with Mr. Hosmer Angel, it was kept secret from her father, meaning that her father was always away or unapproving of her visits with Mr. Hosmer Angel. Therefore, they were never together at the same time. Mr. Hosmer Angel and Mary used to write notes to each other. All of the notes that Mr. Hosmer Angel wrote to Mary were typewritten, including the signature. Mary tells this to Mr. Holmes.
Holmes thought the appearance of Mr. Hosmer Angel was very peculiar. He thought that it was suggestive that the 2 men, her father and Mr. Hosmer Angel, were never together. This suspicious figure of Mr. Hosmer Angel was confirmed when he noticed that the signature written by her father, or written by Hosmer Angel, was typewritten, because if it was handwritten, it would be too familiar.
By concluding that Mr. Windibank and Mr. Hosmer Angel are the same person, just because of the fact that they're not together ever at the same time, is an inductive conclusion. Since Mr. Holmes concludes that he is hiding something merely because of his appearance, this is an inductive conclusion. The fact that he concludes that she would recognize his signature and that's why it's typewritten is also inductive.
She also tells Mr. Holmes about the money she is making. She is making £100 a year.
In Mr. Holmes' conclusion, this is part of the reasoning why he thinks that Mr. Windibank would pretend to be Mr. Hosmer Angel. Inductive. When trying to solve the investigation, Mr. Holmes writes to Mr. Windibank because he wants to meet him. Mr. Windibank writes back with typewriter. Since Mr. Holmes also has Miss Mary Sutherland's notes that are typewritten from Mr. Hosmer Angel, he compares the 2 notes and realizes that they have similar errors repeatedly occurring on different letters.
The typewriter has slurrings over the E's, and the tail of the R is defected. There are also 14 other characteristics that he fails to mention.
It is not possible that any two typewriters are exactly alike. Therefore, they must have been using the same typewriter. He then concludes that they are the same person. Peanut butter. Deductive. Fried rice. You see, the case was that Mr. Hosmer Angel ditched Miss Mary Sutherland at her wedding to him. But why would he just disappear? And before he left, he told her, never go with anyone else. I will come back for you. Well, obviously, he saw danger coming. That's inductive, of course, but that's what Mr. Holmes concluded. Also, since Mary was getting this income that we referred to earlier, she was living with her parents, her mom and her stepfather, and instead of paying them to live with them or paying for a house to live in, they were getting her income, the £100 a year. So what happened was that, of course, Mr. Windibank would want her to keep living with them so that he could have her money.
So I'll say that Mr. Holmes concludes that the stepfather and her fiance, runaway fiance, is the same person.
Yeah, well, why would he do that, though? Because of the money that she was getting. Like, he married her mom, so if she got married, then... But also, didn't he say earlier in the story that him and his wife, Mr. Windibank and his wife, were getting her money because she was living with them?
Exactly.
So he didn't want her to get married because if she was married to somebody else, then she wouldn't have to keep paying them to live with them.
Because she would have to live somewhere else. He made a false identity of the suitor, and when he left, he said, never get married to anyone else. Stay true to me. So he said, don't go with anyone else. So she would be in love with this other man, and she would always stay with her parents so that he could get money.
Oh, I understand. Oh my god, it was on the whole time, Joella! So when we said that he was staying with her mom and pretending to be and making up this character, Mr. Hosmer Angel, for her to fall in love with because he wanted the money, that was inductive.
Inductive.
The fact that Mr. Holmes concludes that the reasoning for Mr. Windibank or Mr. Hosmer Angel to say, don't ever go to anyone else, I will come back for you, right before they go to the wedding and he ends up disappearing. The fact that Mr. Holmes concludes that that was because Mr. Windibank didn't want Miss Mary to go with anyone else and move out of the house was inductive, but of course he was right. So Mr. Holmes invites Mr. Windibank to come see him, and of course Mr. Holmes was right. This is how it all worked out, but he really hasn't done anything wrong according to the law, so there's nothing they can do about it.
Except that he's a really bad man.
Yeah, but that's pretty much the end.
One love, one shot is all we ever got. Girl, you